Right, so Glenroe.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Valerie, for this invitation. And thank you to all of you for coming. I'll have to deal with the Windows
I can do that.
No. It's fine.
Okay.
It's a pleasure to speak with you today. And I want to talk, just give you a sort of brief overview about some of my work in digital humanities and 18th century studies through the angle of sort of point of entry of networks. So thinking about networks as a digital object, or as a digital entity. And in fact, the longer history of networks and the way that we think about networks for research purposes. And we know that the network as a metaphor, or as a technical idea, or as a technical infrastructure, although the word existed before, comes into common parlance in the 19th century around the ideas around the telegraph and different transformations in information technology, which sort of changed the way people discuss about not only how entities were connected, but how they themselves were socially connected to each other. And so there were no real precedents for these new lines and wires that came up. And so there began to be a different vocabulary around webs, around labyrinths, around mazes. They weren't quite sure how to classify these new things, but they changed the landscape, not only informationally, but also physically. So this is New York at the end of the 19th century, where the line sort of hummed physically above, and there was a real materiality of the exchange of information through these networks. And we inherit this notion of the network that is inherently technical, that's composed of nodes and edges. And of course, today, this is translated into the network of networks, that is the internet. So this is a map of the internet in 2005. But again, we're quite comfortable within this infrastructure. And there's some work by sociologists like Manuel Castells that says it's sort of, we begin thinking within the paradigm, the informational paradigms in which we belong, we begin thinking everything in terms of that paradigm. And so now, which is quite true today, we think of everything in terms of networks. So there's networks everywhere. Everybody's trying to trace different sorts of networks, whether they be socio-technical or informational, regardless. And this is translated into the digital sphere fairly commonly, and also into larger considerations of how we engage with archives. So we're trying to find, our archives can help us to identify networks. And in fact, one of the first projects that I worked on was between Oxford and Stanford as a postdoc, the Mapping the Republic of Letters project led by Dan Edelstein. And there we took 70,000 letters, actually just the metadata about the letters, and plotted them on a map. And we called it a network. Now, whether or not it is a network remains up to interpretation, but it looks like a network. It seems like a network. There are nodes, there are edges. A letter starts somewhere, goes somewhere else. So there's an exchange of information. We can use that system to sort of delineate. Here where we have Voltaire's network, entre guillemets, in blue compared to Locke's in yellow. And then this has continued to be a domain of research in Stanford and elsewhere. And we have different tools now. This is a new visualization of Voltaire's correspondence network in Palladio, which is the new system at Mapping the Republic of Letters. And so this led sort of quickly into this notion about, is this a network? Were these letters and networks? It didn't tell us anything about the letters themselves. And so to me, that was something that I wanted to work on personally after leaving the project and moving on to my own work. And in fact, it also raised lots of questions about what was in the data, what wasn't in the data. And in fact, using a system that was built on this sort of geographical understanding, spatial understanding of a network, did in fact bring up lots of questions about what couldn't be represented within this field. And what we came to find out, that there was lots of letters by Voltaire in particular that don't show up on the map because for one reason or another, there wasn't a point in space that one could map that letter to. And so if there wasn't a complete line in this network, if the letter went to Les Cantons Suisses, well, that's not one point. So that didn't fit into this system. And so that letter was just excluded from the network. So that led us to all sorts of considerations about how does this look at your data? So in one way, it's a great way of exploring the data, but it again didn't move us any further into this notion of maybe what a network is or could be. And then about the same time, social network analysis from sociology came into, started to become, right, no? Yes, started to be more or less used in the humanities, and we began to think about non-spatial, non-geographical networks. So how we can think about them and what those were made up. So immediately I thought, well, could we do this with the letters, and what would that mean? And there was a lot of work going on with how you extract this sort of information, social network information, from, let's say, literary texts. And so there was a colleague in Lausanne that took the Confession of Rousseau and sort of did a calculation about mentions of people's names every few pages and generated what he called the sort of Facebook of Rousseau's Facebook, which was really interesting. I'm not sure how far it got us from a research network, but nonetheless, it's interesting to think about how we can expand, I think, the notion of networks further using that paradigm. And there's been fairly successful work here on the Dutch Republic of Letters in the 17th century by Scott Weingart. There's great papers by Ruth Anhert and her husband at Cambridge, working again in the 17th, I think 16th, 17th century in England about finding networks of in Protestant circles using the social network analysis. So it's a full field, it's a robust field, and it's one that's fairly interesting. And then one of the favorite visualizations I have is they did a social network analysis of Wikipedia. So it's the history of philosophy based on Wikipedia, which is interesting in of itself. And it maps fairly well if you think Hegel and Kant are in the middle with Marx over to the side and the classics up top left. It's a fairly convincing but also sort of playful and ludic. I mean, it's a folksonomy, so it's generated from Wikipedia. And then more recently, from my own work, I've been thinking about how we can even challenge that notion of the social network and using actor network theory, which is most famous practitioner is probably Bruno Latour. And the notion here is that it's been used a lot in science and technology studies. And the notion here is that I think Latour goes back to a non-technical, or he wants to think about the network not in terms of the internet, not in terms of these nodes and edges, but more in the sense that Diderot used it as a réseau. So more in the sense that Diderot uses it in the Rêve de d'Alembert as a sort of generative structure that you're not quite sure where the end and the beginning is. And so what you have to do is sort of dive into the structure and trace its different nodes, which are in fact what they call actors. And here an actor can be any entity, human, non-human, in any form. And so for me, that was fairly interesting because it allowed me to think about text or pieces of text or ideas or words, things like that can function as actors within these actor networks, and in a way that sort of pushes the boundaries and pushes forward these ideas. And then Latour himself has published on how digital archives can be informed by this sort of approach, which allows you to take an interesting sort of empirical, what he calls a radical empirical take on the archive, where in computer science they call it data-driven research. So it's the idea that you don't come to the data with any preconceived sort of hypotheses. You sort of start running algorithms or measures, and you see what sort of floats to the top of what comes out in this. And then the act then of the social network or actor network theorist is to describe as fully as possible as they can these different traces that you find within the archive. And so that's sort of within the spirit that I've tried to work on Voltaire's Correspondence, which is a large archive, which is a big archive, and it's something that was one of the first things that you probably all are familiar with, the Voltaire Foundation's giant 204 volume, which will be finished this year, next year, 2022. So we're all happy. Of Complète de Voltaire. So the first 50 volumes of that was compiled in the 60s and 70s by Theodore Besterman, and it was the correspondence, what he called the definitive correspondence of Voltaire, which was not definitive nor complete, but no correspondence ever is. But it's fairly large, so it's 22,000 letters all told, 15,000 of which are by Voltaire. And so we were able to put that together as a research database. In and of itself, it was very, I mean, it's an interesting data set, and it's one that's it's at the heart of the Mapping the Republic of Letters project. It's the first data set in the Electronic Enlightenment project. It's the largest data set within that project. So there's always an essai Voltaire. There's always whenever you do a search on Electronic Enlightenment, there's so much Voltaire that you'll always end up finding Voltaire no matter what you're looking for, unless perhaps it's in English or Italian. And so we were able to take, let's say, Voltaire's correspondence, the 21,000 letters, and take that to we have his works in the digital format, and make a sort of large archive, a big 13 million word archive. And the idea was to sort of see, not in any fundamentally really complex computational way, but just taking that archive and comparing it with others that existed. So existing archives out in the world, out in the wild, and seeing if we could trace sort of different sorts of networks within the correspondence, or using the correspondence as itself a sort of network to explore other things. So the first thing we looked at was dictionaries, which we know that this is a passage from the Littré, and so we know that dictionaries are great sort of nodes of dissemination of different snippets of text, and especially in the 19th century. And the Littré, Voltaire is the most cited author in the Littré, and so we wanted to see if we could leverage that sort of information. Where if we take, for example, the notion that Voltaire is not a very innovative stylist, which is sort of the idea that we have. What if we took this notion? Well, where is he the most inventive? When does he make up a word? Where can we find his neologisms, which are actually hard to find? But dictionaries are good at that. So if we can leverage information that dictionaries already have, and in this case, the Littré wasn't much help because there's no sort of structural separation between the definition of this word and the first use instance of Voltaire. So we were lucky to have a digital instance of the Trésor de la langue française informatisée, so the big TLF dictionary, in which the etymology section is clearly sort of cordoned off, and we can extract basically every time there is a first use case of Voltaire in the TLF, we extract that information and we save that word. So we were able to generate a list of about 70 neologisms that are meant that Voltaire is meant to have coined or used quite frequently after. And so these became, in effect, the sort of nodes of a neologism network within the correspondence. And the idea here was we had a certain intuition, but we weren't quite sure, so we wanted to test it, that Voltaire, who claims to be a classicist and claims to hate neologisms, uses them quite a bit, and in fact uses them in a social way, in a way where he will send them to, we think, to a correspondent first, and sort of wait to see if it comes back. And if it does, perhaps then that word, he'll go on to use it again with another correspondent, and then perhaps it will even sort of filter into his printed works. So that was the sort of how we came to this idea. And so some words are fairly interesting. Autocratrice, apparently he makes up, which the TLF says, of course, it's related to Catherine of Russia, and it is, but in fact, this allows us to test even these attestations in the dictionary. So we can go back to the database and look for all these different instances of autocratrice. And in fact, it goes back much earlier in his correspondence where he can't be talking about Catherine, but it's still related to Russia. And so there are other autocrateurs, autocratrices, and then eventually that comes to represent Catherine the Great. And so this is just a quick way of taking this word, turning the word into a vector of exploration and seeing where it comes. And then his best sort of neologisms are all about writing. Grimouillage is sort of écriture illisible that he uses with different things. And then again, by using different databases, so turning this into an archive and then moving out into other archives to which we have access, we can see where other writers take up this word and use it. And so we get a network that traces from Voltaire into his correspondence through Damilaville, through Mirabeau, Théophile Gautier, Honoré Balzac. So it begins to think about a strange network of gribouillage into the 19th century. And the same with Folliculaire, which is probably his most famous neologism, which is a sort of what they call in England a grub street writer. So it's c'est un faiseur de feuilles, un fréron, that he says, and it shows up in Candide, and everybody assumes it's in Candide, but it's in the Correspondence at exactly the same time, exactly the same year. And here we can't really distinguish between where if he used it first in the Correspondence or in Candide, but it seems to be co-constitutive. And again, we can trace this then through where it gets picked up quite quickly by Diderot and others, and then finally Napoleon will use it in his own correspondence in 1797 for certaines folliculaires. So this was one sort of way of thinking about Voltaire, and bringing up Candide. Another point of entry we wanted to think about was how Voltaire names himself, or he doesn't sometimes name himself. So Candide's a perfect example. This is the cover page of the title page of Candide, which is meant to be translated from German, which it wasn't, by a Dr. Ralph who doesn't exist. Usually it would say in Amsterdam, which it was published in London. So the whole thing is a sort of is a supercherie, but it's nonetheless interesting. And so that led us to think about, well, how can we have this correspondence? We know that he doesn't always sign his name Voltaire. He perhaps signs it different ways. We know that Voltaire in and of itself is a pseudonym. So just that question is interesting. And here we were just, again, a simple way of extracting this sort of information from a digital archive. We have all of his signatures that have already been encoded, so we can extract them. And it was fairly impressive. So there was about 45% didn't have a signature at all. And that for various reasons. Sometimes he's writing to somebody, doesn't need to sign off. They just know who it is. It's in his own hand, whatever it may be. And then of the other signatures, the 8,000 letters that did have a signature, what struck us most was that there were, in fact, 586 unique signatures of this 8,000. And that we sort of said, well, how could that doesn't even make sense. We just had no idea that there was 586 different names of Voltaire. And then we really got into it, and it's a tour de force. I mean, it's somebody that loves to play with his own identity in the different ways, and he changes his identity through the letters to different peoples in lots of different ways. So most of the time he signs with a V in a period, but this, he just adds it to everything. So le Suisse V, le Vieux Suisse, le Petit Suisse, le Suisse à l'Obroge V, la Marmotte des Alpes V, l'Ermite V. And so he adds, all of these become sort of certain points on a larger network. And then he adds it du Vieux Suisse, it becomes abrogated. There's thematic constellations of different ways. He's the hermit, he's the solitary person. We know he was in Ferney, or he always felt himself far from Paris. And so this shows up in the way that he signs these different letters to different people. He becomes a sort of obsessed with his age and getting old and sick. So he's always le malade de Ferney, le pauvre malade, le vieux malade, le pauvre malade, all these different ways of it. We can trace a moment in 1771 where he had a problem with his eyesight. So he just tells everybody, signs his letters, that he's going blind. So he was a bit of a drama queen, we'd say, in common parlance. So he's le vieil aveugle de Ferme, le vieil aveugle des montagnes, etc. And then beyond just the sort of richness of all these different combinations, le vieux solitaire malade, le vieux malade ermite, etc. We have different personas that he puts on. He's sort of the bookman. He calls himself Guillemet, which is a great pun in French, because it is a name, but it's also typographical. So he's Guillemet, le typographe de Lyon. And we'll get into where he uses that. He's a bibliothécaire, le vieux pro, he becomes a churchman, he's a capucin indigne, all these different faces that he takes on, and then some that are just defy sort of classification. Comme L'oncle et la nièce, if you know a little bit about Voltaire, you realize what that's about, le vieux bonhomme de Ferney, etc. And my favorite, Voltaire qui a 100 ans.
The microphone's on, so
Oh, no, sorry.
I can't shut them down.
And so we again, just the richness of this was somewhat surprising for us, but it allowed us to think about networks of sociability. So with whom is he using these? Are there different repetitions? Is there more than just a sort of explosion of creativity that he wants to sort of reinvent himself with all these different people? And so here, there's one that's quite famous. There is where he's writing to D'Alembert and then later Condorcet, where he calls himself he calls himself Raton, and then D'Alembert is Bertrand, and that's from La Fontaine, Le Singe et le Chat, where Bertrand the monkey, who is Malin, lets the cat sort of burn his paws, getting the marmot from the fire. And so it's a sort of flattering image for Voltaire, whose order says, "Oh, I'm your servant monkey to do your bidding." So, and it goes on, and then eventually he talks about les deux Bertrands. So it's Condorcet and D'Alembert within a circuit of 87 letters that goes from 1772 all the way up to his death. So it's a fairly significant chunk of letters. So it's a way of thinking about how these letters move through this phase. There's another, there's a circuit of Voltaire de Marmothe with the Duc de Choiseul, and then the Guillemet circuit, which I mentioned earlier, where Voltaire writes to this time the Duchesse de Choiseul, where he signs off Guillemet et typographe de la ville de Lyon. And here this continues through lots and lots of different letters. And in one he addresses her as Madame Gargantua. So there's all these games that he's sort of playing with his correspondence. And then finally, he decides he's done. So ce n'est plus Guillemet, ses frères Voltaire, Capucin, Indigne. And then he starts a new sort of a new circuit that goes through 30 letters, which is a sort of who's who of the powerful in the country. So it's a way of sort of moving, again, choosing a point within this large data set that we weren't quite sure was already there, that we just found by doing a sort of simple extraction of the signatures, and then tracing how they circulate through the different correspondence. And then finally, the last circuit is a Latin one, where he uses Latin in a sign-off. And here it was clear that he uses it with literary figures, but mainly with people with whom he went to school. And so here that brought us to this notion of the usage of Latin. What does it mean in his correspondence? And we know he went to Louis le Grand, and we know that the friendships he made there with the Duc de Richelieu, with Thériault, with lots of these different friends, will last his entire lifetime. And so they're very meaningful. And we also knew that sort of Latin poetry was sort of drummed into people in the pedagogical moment of time. They had to commit to memory long passages of Latin poetry. In the top three were, of course, Virgil, Ovid, and Horace, and this shows up. Here again. We took an existing database of Latin poetry. We ran it against the correspondence to see where Voltaire, what authors he's using and with whom. And here, no surprise, we get Horace, Virgil, and Ovid in the top three, and these are the number of citations that he uses in the correspondence. And then some were more surprising. So we found a sort of a citation of Manilius, which we had no idea existed before, and in fact wasn't annotated in the Westermann edition. Westermann says this is a Latin quote from somewhere, which now you can. I mean, I feel sort of, now you just put the quote into Google and it pops right up that it's Manilius, but in 1965 or whenever, there wasn't, I don't think, a correspondence of Manilius. So nonetheless, and so here again, with the notion of, well, does this constitute a network? Why not? He's using Latin with some people for different reasons, with other people's not. And so here we were able to take what's called an ontology, which they built in Stanford, to describe the correspondence. So all of the different people within the electronic enlightenment correspondence, and assign to them a social category or a social network, whether it be literary, aristocracy, elite, whatever. And so we were able to think about, well, he uses the most Latin with Frederick II of Prussia. And then the second and third are people with whom he went to school. Algarotti is another homme de lettres, and d'Alembert, etc. So we began to think about, again, taking just this idea of maybe this constitutes a network, maybe not, but we can leverage this data with this other existing data set, which is this correspondence, which you'll see a description of that, just to think about how elite was Voltaire's correspondence, and it turns out very, very elite, and perhaps even the subset of the correspondence was even more elite, the way that he uses Latin, and then of course gender was an obvious vector which wasn't there, but we found one letter in which he uses some Latin with a woman only, which is with, again, the Duchesse de Choiseul. And here he says pour moi madame, and he gives two passages from Virgil, and then he says vous entendez le latin, but we're not sure if she knew Latin or not. Vous savez ce que cela veut dire, and then he gives a translation. So it's a sort of early modern mansplaining. He says, here's the Latin, which of course you understand, but let me tell you what it is anyway. And then again, just moving through this pretty quickly, we're able to see the different contours of this subset of a network. And to me, this makes more sense as a network, because it's based on what's inside the letters, and a conscious act by Voltaire to include or not include a Latin to certain people, rather than just a line on a map. And then, then we have his old teacher, Louis Legrand, is in there, also Olivier. And then you can go backwards. You can sort of say, well, who are the respondents that send Latin back? And is this a different set? And in fact, Frederick doesn't send any Latin back to Voltaire. Make of that what you will. I don't know what to make of it, but that's what it is. D'Alembert is quite good at it, and then the rest move out. So it's the same sort of network, but much more literary than the people with whom he uses Latin, the people that write Latin back, which perhaps again isn't surprising in any way, but it's just another way of thinking about how these networks exist. And then this was done with the technology that's called sequence alignment. So it's a way of thinking about reception and reuse. So we were able to take one data set, the Latin poetry, compare it to Voltaire, and find all the similar passages within it. So this is a technology that's used for lots of things, sequencing DNA mainly, but the algorithm that we came up with, you could also use plagiarism detection algorithms, but we found that those were too strict. And in fact, when you're dealing with citation or recitation or reuse, you want to be able to find passages that are not quite exact, because the interesting parts are what's changed or doesn't come through, or what's used by memory. And so we sort of made our own algorithm based on these bioinformatical ones, which I won't sort of bore you with the details, but it sort of chops up text in a way. If you take the first two lines from Rousseau's social contract, l'homme est libre partout dans les fers, etc., you turn these into what are known as trigrams, so 3 words: l'homme libre partout, libre partout faire. And so you can see that by reducing the text to these small entities, they're quite rare. So the occurrence of homme libre partout in 2 different data sets, the computer would say that's an event, that's something that should be looked at. And then in fact it says, then look at everything to the right of that and everything to the left of that, and then save as much as you think that this is, and then save also a bit of the context around that. And so we've used this for the encyclopédie. That's what we built it for. So the idea of thinking about the encyclopédie as a work of compilation anyway, how can we get at to the pieces of perhaps they weren't so great in their citation strategies or practices, and in fact they weren't. Whole passages. So it's no surprise that people in the encyclopedia would use Pierre Bayle. And here in the article on Spinoza, there's a long passage at the end, which comes directly from Bayle, without any indication that this is Bayle. And in fact, it's actually Bayle's voice. It finishes, je finis par dire que. That's Bayle that's speaking in the encyclopedia, and that we did know that, and you wouldn't know that if you were reading the encyclopedia. And so this became a really rich sort of area of interest, because it was for the first time we thought, well, we identified the Latin. Most of the time we knew that the Latin was there. I mean, it's just there, it's in the letter, you can see it. Here, again, if you're reading the Spinoza article in the encyclopedia, you would have no notion whatsoever that this was from Bayle. And so here we begin to think that this is, the computer isn't so dumb. It can actually tell us a lot of, it can point us into ways of really thinking, of reconstituting a sort of network of reuse. And we found lots of, we could find works in translation. So here we were able to find where Jaucourt uses Locke's second treatise all over, which is an important thing, because obviously you couldn't use the second treatise. It was dangerous. It was a banned work. So there's no way, even if you wanted to cite it, you could cite it, because then the encyclopedia would lose its privilege by proxy. But because you said so, he doesn't say anything. He just uses Locke, and this is by a later translation. So we can again, because it's fuzzy, because it's not an exact matching thing, we can use later text and sort of, again, not in a way of exhaustively finding every passage of Locke, but pointing us towards a section in, let's say, the article on government, where you should know, and we should know intuitively, there's probably some Locke in here, but we're not sure where. Here it can just give us a moment of where we can move in. So this led us to think about, well, all works aren't sort of created equal. And so perhaps some works like La Henriade, they would be cited, and they were cited, but Les Lettres Philosophiques were never cited for the same reason that you couldn't cite Locke in the Encyclopedia, because it was a banned work. And so there's all sorts of gymnastics that go around. Here there are quotations. Here there is Voltaire that Jaucourt says, but he says, well, it's in the mélange de littérature et philosophie. It's in this collected works or whatever, a sort of non-threatening title, but it's in fact Lettres sur les Anglais. And then finally, depending on, so as works get more dangerous, these gymnastics get more complicated. So it would be, we know that De l'Esprit from Helvétius was another banned work, and in fact responsible for the Encyclopedia, in fact, losing its privilege in 1758. So to cite it would be rather bold. And Jaucourt does just that, but without any structural sense. And it's just, he just sort of tips his hat here. He says, c'est dit un beau génie de ce siècle. So it's up to the reader to sort of figure out, the cognoscenti, to figure out who's he talking about. Is this a code? So, and there is sorts of codes. So Voltaire is l'historien philosophe. I think Montesquieu is le plus grand génie de ce siècle. This is just un beau génie de ce siècle. So there are different codes and different ways of thinking of it. So this again brought us back to notions of tracing these sorts of things together. And in this case, maybe in a way of thinking about communication circuits in a Darnton sort of way, and thinking about how even print artifacts contribute to in a larger sort of ecosystem. How can we trace that through just finding certain things like repeated passages, which seem simple, but are in fact quite complex. And then just to finish up, to trace something like an event, a media event, if you will, avant la lettre. We know that in 1755, there's the earthquake in Lisbon, and it sort of shakes Voltaire's faith in Providence. And he writes this long poem on the disaster de Lisbonne. And so we can find traces of the poem as early as the 2nd of January, the year after. So we know that it goes out, and he sends it out to people. And then, in fact, in the poem, people say that they were in the room and they heard Voltaire sing the poem. But what's interesting is that the first passages are shorter, because we're using a modern edition. And in fact, what you see is that Voltaire is not done with the text, and we have an earlier version of the text that's perhaps that he changes. And in fact, we see that the passages get sort of longer and longer because he wanted to he wasn't happy with this ending, which was too even pessimistic for him. He says, que faut-il au mortel, il faut souffrir, se soumettre en silence, adorer et mourir. So that was the original ending of the poem, which even for Voltaire, he thought he needed to soften, and he does. And then you sort of see these people comment in the correspondence. So it's a way, it's a sort of, they're tweeting about the middle one here. He says, voici la conclusion, et c'est tout ce que j'ai pu avoir de cette pièce retouchée. So we know that he retouched it. And he says, well, I was in the room, I heard it. So it's sort of, he's broadcasting this poem that's in the works. And then as a media event, finally it ends up on Rousseau's desk, and Rousseau, we know, writes this long response, which is, you know, a 7,000 word letter, which then gets published. Lettre de, whichever one calls on optimism. And then we know, of course, that Candide is a sort of response to that. So again, this is a sort of network. I mean, this is some sort of thing we can trace through these different paragraphs. Yeah, how am I on time?
Yeah, that's fine. Just checking collection.
All right. And then finally, again, thinking of these ways of communication circuits. This is a great quote from Voltaire to Madame de Défend, where he says, "Don't bother reading." I think it's Helvétius, it's Delhomme. He says, "Don't bother reading the whole thing because it's not worth your time. But I'll give you the petit diamant that I found. And I'll give you that." He becomes a sort of Reader's Digest for his correspondence. And then he sort of describes his method. Je passe ma vie à chercher des pierres précieuses dans du fumier. So that's him sort of saying, I'll get through the muck for you and give you the good passages. But these passages we can sort of find where they are now, and then trace where they go, and then also see when he reuses things in certain contexts. So another good one is another Latin phrase, but not from the classics in this case, but from Rabelais, where the greatest of clerks is not always the wisest of men. And Montaigne takes this back up, and Rabelais invents this, and Montaigne does it, and at the same time he's working on Candide, Voltaire goes back and reads Rabelais, and then it's also the same time he starts using this quote again with his correspondence. But what's interesting is it becomes a sort of code for criticizing the ministers, of which many are his friends. So the Duc de Choiseul is a friend, and he says, well, somebody will say a sort of critical moment about what the government's doing, and he'll say, well, you know, as Notre Maître François says, the greatest of clerks are not always the wisest of men. And so it's a way of sort of underhandingly criticizing government using Rabelais. And we can see again this notion of almost a sort of ping pong where the passage goes out, and then you can see later on somebody else reuses it with him, and it comes back in. And so that's sort of where we're at, looking within the correspondence himself. And then most recently, we've been thinking about networks of influence. So we have a really big database from here, from the BNF that was given to us. It's 130,000 books digitized by Gallica. So at one point it was Gallica in 2015, which is now bigger. And so it's the sort of this huge untenable archive that we don't know what to do with. It's mostly 19th century. But the idea then is, well, can we use these same sorts of technologies to move into this huge data space and see what's going on? And so it causes all sorts of problems, but we're able to do some things. And at least if you start from one work of Voltaire, or you start from one thing, you can trace sort of where it shows up. And here, what's interesting and it's called the TGB, the Très Grande Base, or the Très Grande Bibliothèque. And here you can see there's a real dictionary effect. And so it's interesting in this sense, we get back to this notion of Voltaire used in the dictionary, but it's not just the Littré, but it's lots and lots of different dictionaries. And we can almost see an institutionalization of Voltaire almost immediately in the beginning of the 19th century, where he's not only used as a use case, but as somebody that you should emulate, somebody whose style you should want to parrot. So it's the sort of canonization of Voltaire that we can think about, him moving through the 19th century, and then also at points. So he shows up in Villemain's Cours de Littérature as a sort of poet. There's a point, however, where it becomes really interesting, where Voltaire is the national poet at the beginning of the 19th century, and he's eventually replaced in that function by Hugo. And he changes, and what's interesting is to try to sort of chase how Voltaire, the national poet, all of that disappears. His plays don't get shown anymore at the Comédie Française. All of that goes away. But then in the Third Republic, he sort of comes back, and there's always there's an undercurrent of critique of Voltaire, because he becomes a sort of he becomes a proxy for all of the Enlightenment, for anti-religious thought and whatnot. But then he sort of makes a heroic comeback at the end. With, for example, in the Catechisme philosophique républicain, where it's different texts that are used. So at the beginning, it's all this theater that's reused or put out there. And at the end, it's les lettres philosophiques, it's Candide. It's very much the idea we have of Voltaire today, which is, in fact, a late 19th century Third Republic, not invention, but that's just sort of how it evolves for a variety of different reasons. And so for us, it's interesting to think about that again we knew, but so what happens to Voltaire in the 1840s when it's this moment of change, and people, his plays are still played a little bit, but he's in the process of being sort of replaced before he's refound at the end of the 19th century. So this again is ways of thinking how we can redefine networks, not in a geospatial or even in an individualistic sort of social way, but as networks of text through different ways. And I'll just stop there, thinking about moving beyond these sort of different ways of thinking of anything can be a network within this notion, or anything is at least an actor in a network that remains to be traced. And so using digital archives becomes interesting, because all of the different points, and as you're working on an encyclopedia, you realize how much work there is to be done. And so just identifying or saying how far do you go in one given article, you could mark up every word and make that a link to every other word. And I mean, it becomes a sort of daunting task. But later on, it should be, the more work you put in at the beginning, the better the research should be at the end. And so I would just sort of stop there and take your questions. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Glenn, for sharing your experience and your knowledge about Voltaire's correspondence. Just one question that strikes me, a point that strikes me, when you mentioned the fact that Voltaire called himself the solitary, the hermit, and then is a highly sociable man through his correspondence. So how would you interpret or reconcile this paradox?
Oh yeah, no. I think he's constantly looking for, I wouldn't call it pity, but sort of this notion that he has to live away from the capital, and he can't be like Diderot, where he's at every night's dinner. So he's consciously saying, well, I'm out here, and you have to come to me, basically. And so I think for him, it's part of his. It becomes part of who he is intensely social, but also necessarily exiled from the point of sociability, which is Paris.
So that's not incompatible. Okay.
No.
So I guess we had questions, especially in relation to our own digital project. Sure. So maybe Kim, did you want to perhaps start?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, I just had a small question on the slide. Slides before, not the other one. Yeah. The changes in the text, was that you, or is that technology? That's the
system. So
that's the system.
It's able to. So it's saying what's highlighted are the passages that the system says these are related. That's
So
what's going in. So it knows that because of the way that I showed that it's a sort of the sort of shingling in English, we say,
Yeah.
so the chevauchement of these words, there can be holes. And so it's just saying there's one anchor here, one anchor at the end. Within the middle, there can be lots of different holes and different changes. And in fact, then we use a second just very stupid text comparator that just says here's what's changed.
Okay.
Just as I mean, it's not perfect either, but it's a way of saying these are the different changes, and they can be. A lot of it is, especially in this collection, it's from Guernica, so that's it's the output is not great. Not to criticize, but it's the output. If you've ever been in a Guernica text, it's great because they give you the full text, but it's done automatically, and then it's OCR. Yeah, it's OCR. So some of these will be OCR errors, but some are valid changes, and then some are even larger.
Follow that up.
Yeah.
So are there two steps here then? Do you first of all apply something to the text, the common passages, and then compare to see what they are?
Yeah. I mean, this is done. So this is just done on, let's say, the browser side. So this is just done as a display. The passage or the whole thing is what exists in the database. So the passage, which is what's in blue, is, let's say, you're entering the database. The context around it, associated with its metadata, that's the sort of back of it. This is the display. It just says these two things are related, and here's the differences we find in them. But that you just turn on or off. It's a toggle that you turn on or off. It doesn't. That information doesn't exist in the database.
Sorry to be a bit technical, but I mean, so what do you use to get the first results then? Can you do it yourself?
Yeah.
Or I mean, could I do it tomorrow, or do I?
Well, no, there's certain steps. It's a system that we built called TextPair, and it's at the University of Chicago. So it's an artful project where I did my PhD. And so they have a great system, full text system called Philologic, and it runs all their databases. And then it's become a suite of different things, because once you have a full text engine like that, in fact, what it does is it indexes all the words that exist and knows where they are. And so then you can apply different algorithms on top of that, which we do. So you make a Philologic instance, then you say, well, I have this database, compare it to another database and show me all the, and it builds this sort of third database, which is based on reuse. So it's I
You
wouldn't.
know what you're doing then.
You can do it. It's doable. It's not sort of point and click doable, but it's not that hard either.
Yeah, this makes me think of the corpus. In fact, we're building with the anthology, which is the parallel tool in the encyclopedia. I guess you had a look.
Sure.
So it needs to be developed. Of course, we need to implement new functionalities, but I guess this would be very interesting to have. I mean, our database would be all the texts that are in the anthology.
Yeah.
So would you recommend or any specific use or to for example, trace expressions or the evolution through time, or how would you see that?
So of interest to you, working in English, we had a project with Artful in Oxford in 2013-14 on commonplaces. And it basically we got Gale Cengage to give us Echo, and they did. So that's 18th, Echo, so it's 200,000 works. And so what it ended up in a lot of these projects, you do this, you say, well, I have this idea, we're going to build a virtual commonplace book or whatever it was a good idea because we're going to compare Echo to itself. And we did that. But be careful what we ask for, because it just generated so much data that we were inundated. And in fact, one thing we found out, which was sort of interesting, is that Echo is pretty much 50% Bible, which again makes sense. But until you see it, and in fact, you're just constantly confronted with the Bible everywhere, you don't really realize it. And it's just this. And then finally, I mean, we were so inundated with sort of biblical, and then finally we found Locke, and we go, oh, great, it's fantastic. We found some Locke. No, it was a commonplace book on Locke on the Bible. I mean, so like it was really impressive because so what we had to do, we actually had to turn on a button that said "Turn off the Bible," which, as an American, I found took some pleasure in it. Turn Bible
Like
off.
do research and do, like
Yeah,
accept,
yeah,
accept the Bible.
take Bible out, and then it was Shakespeare, and then he dominated in a way that was really impressive. So it was sort of, if you were to do a graph, the Bible will be up here and Shakespeare, and then you take the Bible out, and then Shakespeare goes way up here, and so it was interested in, and then after that it's Pope, and then they get down into this other, and then Thompson was everywhere for whatever reason. And the Seasons was this poem that just, and so it was a really interesting project. But yeah, so I would take Echo. If you can get a hold of Echo, you can ask Gail to give you access. We still have sort of access, but I mean, people in English studies it's in 18th century. It's a great resource.
But how could
it's
you avoid,
underutilized.
sorry, how could you avoid distortions like this?
Well, no, I mean, you have to be, if you have a small corpus, we compared the whole thing to itself. So it was, I mean, we pared it down. We tried to get rid of, there aren't technically doublons, but there are obviously duplicate texts. I mean, there's a second printing or a third printing. We tried to get rid of those. So we got it down to about 130,000 documents. But then 130,000 by 130,000, I mean, it was just this huge thing. It took a month to run the calculations to get all the so again, I wouldn't advise that. But if you're starting from a small corpus, and then you move out into this large, that's the way that you can do it, because you're going one towards all of that rather than this thing. But I mean, it's a fantastic resource, and it's a resource that should be used more for that sort of work, to see this sort of, I mean, it gets us, we don't have an equivalent in French literature in 18th century studies. I mean, it gets you as close to what you could call the literary field or literary culture or what in the 18th century as you can get. It's not exhaustive, and it has its own problems, and it has its own history of how it was constructed, but it's nonetheless it's really impressive. So I mean, and barring that, there's other texts that you can go to. But I mean, I think we're sort of embarrassed for riches in the 18th century, because it's not quite the 19th century where you're inundated everywhere you go just because of the second print revolution. I mean, you just have text everywhere. So it's fairly constrained. So you can think of good projects to sort of trace through the different things. And there's lots of available text everywhere.
Yeah.
When you discuss the future possibilities, I like the idea of structuring a talk based on literary top one.
Yeah.
The thing is, I mean, I can imagine how to do it with a smaller corpus, but how to do it with 200 volumes of Voltaire? I mean, how do you program your search engines? Because sometimes lexical items that do not necessarily translate into literary top volume. So.
Oh yeah, no. So there's an algorithmic approach called topic modeling. So it was made in computer science, but it's built sort of for that. So it's called unsupervised machine learning. So the idea is you can start with, let's say, a set of documents that have labels that somebody has already said this is about, like the Encyclopedia, this is about metaphysics. You can train an algorithm to learn that and then go out and apply that label. That's a sort of classic machine learning. Then there's next step, which is unsupervised. You're saying, I have a bunch of documents, I don't have any labels. Just try to learn what's in them and construct this model, and then go apply that model to other things or reapply it to itself. And it works fairly well. It was designed to sort of take into account large runs of scientific journals, so Nature and Science, and then people have used it to trace sort of epidemiology. You can see, when the Spanish flu hits, you can see the topic about flu and pandemic, and it spikes in 1913. I mean, it's an interesting way about it. And we've tried it on, it should work. We've tried it on the Encyclopedia. We've tried it on the letters, but in fact, letters are tricky because they should be good for this, but they're in fact really they're charged full of semantic material, and in fact too much. So there's too much going on in a letter, because you can, yeah, exactly. No, exactly. And so it gets you a certain way. It's a different way of organizing your data. So but you're still stuck with this idea that it generates these things called topics, which are just which is a list of words that are more probabilistically that have a high probability of occurring together. So it's legible. Some are legible, and some you'll say, oh, this is about the Navy, and this is about something else. Some are just these broad topics, and in fact, there's one that we could just call sociability, that I call sociability, and it's because of letters. And there's always especially in French, veuillez monsieur réserver mes sentiments les plus. You know, there's this huge formula that's there, and there's this sense that there's a formalism within letters. And so that's the biggest topic. It's like 50, it's everywhere. And so again, you sort of have to get rid of that. And then you can get down to ones that are more specific. So it works to a certain degree, but it doesn't get you that close to Topoi. And then, but there's a project called Sator that works specifically on this notion of Topoi. And they go in the other direction, where they've for 20 years sort of by hand annotated text to say this is this topoi and this is not a topoi. And then their idea is that you should now be able to take that and see if you can apply that to other texts. So there's ways of it, but it happens to be one of these, as you said, with metaphor, with any. There's lots of ways that you can really confuse a computer. It's quite good at really dumb, fast things, but slow, complicated things are still pretty good. But there's always ways of, at the very least, it starts a conversation. I mean, it's a way. So we've run this topic over Voltaire's Correspondence, and it's just a different way of. It's a different point of entry. So we think of it that way. And the encyclopedia is the same way. So the encyclopedia is this great work, and well, how do you read it? Do you go A to B or A to Z? That's kind of boring. I don't know. How else do you go into it? It's great that it's now digital, so you don't have to pull down the big folio volumes. But again, so maybe a sort of topic model, or maybe you could just use the taxonomy that comes with it, this system of, and say, well, just give me all the articles on metaphysics and just read that. And it's almost like a sub-dictionary that you create virtually. And Diderot mentions that this is how you should do it, but he almost didn't quite have, the technology wasn't quite right for it yet. Because he wants, I mean, it's clear that Diderot wants you to construct knowledge. I mean, there's a co-construction, and so that's why following the cross references is meant to be a way to critically build your own thing. And so he says, so Voltaire hates that there's all these sort of reactionary religious texts in the encyclopedia. And he says, why are they in there? They shouldn't be in there. And Diderot says, no, you need to be in there, but put in a nice renvoi to another article, a cross-reference to another article, and the person will be confronted with a sort of one view and then another, and then they'll build their own vision on it. So that, to Diderot, is how the cross-references are meant to function. But he then goes on quickly, which as you were building a dictionary, to say, well, it's impossible because you have to have the entire dictionary already in your mind sketched out to know the full system that can link up together. So there's always going to be false links.
And this is how we built, in fact, the encyclopedia. We have three ways of searching. I mean, it's a kind of a, you can search through A to Z, you can search through topics. So, I mean, do you think it's up to the user, or is there a way that is best to discover the content, or do you think they are relevant, those three modes of
what's the third one?
What's the third one? Sorry.
Well,
Keywords, right? A to Z, and by categories, like we have kind of an ontology,
which you've made yourself.
Yeah.
That's good. And then you have cross references.
Yeah. I mean, we should develop that more, but there was the problem that you mentioned, that if we mark each word, I mean, we make links, it's too many, so too many links. So we need to decide, what we connect, etc. So what are your, I mean, have you had a look at the website?
Yeah, no.
What I mean, your experience should help us perhaps.
No, I'm always fascinated because working a long time at Artful and being a literary person, I'm somebody that's very, I mean, keywords are sort of in my in my DNA. But I also know that there is a certain the Google box conundrum, right? So the box is there and it's asking you to formulate a question to which you already know the answer. Like you can't put in the box, you can't make real discoveries. I mean, you can test what you sort of already think is there. And so this is a real, and this is a bias in any sort of search engine, that even in any of the philologic builds, it's built on the notion that, well, if I'm interested in tracing a word over time or seeing where this word occurs all over the encyclopedia, it works really well. That's the question I pose for. But perhaps I want to sort of take a step back and look at how the entire thing is organized. And again, that notion of not entering into the data space with your questions preformed, but trying to allow users different points of entry, different ways of browsing and assembling information. And I think what was nice for us with, even based on keyword searches, is at some point we changed the technology of the way that we displayed it, and it became flatter, but in a way that we had what are called facets. And so you would put in something. So the common examples, if you put in Newton in a headword search in the encyclopedia, there isn't actually a headword on Newton. There's Newtonianism, which is small, but there's not a headword on Newton. And so you go, oh, that was sort of their idea, that they didn't want great men. But if you put in Newton as a keyword, and then you show all the articles in which it occurs, it's the first one. If there's one that just pops up and it's Wallstrop, and you have no idea why, and you go read it, and it's this typical encyclopedia where it says Wallstrop is this bourg in England. Here's its latitude and longitude. Oh, by the way, this is where Isaac Newton was born. And then there's 10 pages. That's the biography of Isaac Newton. So even though they didn't want to include biographies, it's sort of stuck in there. So just showing that different ways of where the word occurs, and then, I mean, it's just one example that's sort of silly, but again, and I don't have the answer to that, but what I'm constantly looking for is different ways where you don't actually have that word already formulated. I mean, we know we're interested in Newton. We know, so you come to your encyclopedia, and what did I type in? I typed in coffee. I typed in Addison. I typed in things that I knew, just to play around with it, and it worked great.
The cool stuff is often a bit down the frequency list.
Yeah.
I've done this with late medieval parliamentary petitions with letters in the 13th century.
Right.
And the first thing you knew already, it's like we said, Voyer,
Yeah.
all this kind of, but it's useful as well because it gives you the structure of the document. You go down a bit,
Yeah.
you go, hang on, I wasn't quite expecting that about.
Exactly. No. And that's sort of sometimes it takes going down. It'd be the second O in Google or something, if you think about the Google results. And in the newspaper age, they called it below the fold. And so somehow getting results that are pertinent. And so there's different systems I work on now that use different algorithms that give you back documents based on some measure of pertinence, which is an informational measure. So it's not necessarily a document in which that word occurs the most frequently, but within that entire corpus where it's been calculated that it's the most pertinent. So there's different ways of thinking, and people can debate that it's not about the sort of nation, but it's again about thinking about how to deliver different documents in different ways, and so that's a pre-calculated, that's a sort of old 40-year-old algorithm in document retrieval, information science. So it's sort of how Google works. So it's, if you type in something in Google, it's based on all sorts of different things that goes on. But basically what it wants to give you, it's not the page that's the most prevalent in your word, but it's the most pertinent to you probably, or based on if you're signed in, if you're not signed in. I mean, it changes and all that, but the notion behind it is that there's a measure that's not just raw frequency or even relative frequency, but there's something, if you take in the whole thing, and that's something we've worked on here with different data sets, but it's an open problem because it's an interesting way of thinking. How do you make knowledge discoverable, not just there, and so people can test what they already know, but how can they sort of how can they draw out things that they didn't know were there? I mean, I think that's
Could
an
be
interesting-
both. I mean,
Could be both. No,
yeah.
no, of course. You have to do the first thing.
Yeah, because when you start searching, I mean, of
Yeah,
course
yeah.
you expect, and then you make discoveries of things you
Yeah,
didn't
no, no.
expect.
We had this tool on the first platform, do you remember?
Yeah.
Semantic analysis
Yeah.
that created, some connections that we didn't think about.
Mm,
And I think this was a bit unsettling for us.
yeah, especially
Because
when it was.
sure that we work
Yeah, yeah.
usually from our intuition and then
No, like I said, you have to do the first part. Like you have to deliver you have to deliver a sort of, I put in a word and I get back. The word. Because if you don't, people will just say, well, I don't know what's going on. But maybe you can deliver, there's another way of it, a secondary or tertiary way of thinking about how you can either build onto that query or just make another sort of interface that's a different sort of query.
I think it was when with linguist Geoffrey Williams, he was trying to trace the word sociability or sociable, and as you said, it was associated with words that were going just before, after, and sometimes there were some strange associations. I don't remember exactly, but yeah, I guess we have to be careful on what we predefine or okay.
One question maybe on you've been involved in many these projects using digital technologies. What about the sustainability of these platforms? That's a good question.
Big question.
So yeah, from your experience, what happens to these, because you move on to you move on to other projects?
Yeah. No. I mean, there's
is that constantly finding funding, so having
no.
second life?
Yeah, no. I mean, some projects are self-funding, like Artful in the University at Chicago. So it's a subscription service, which is sort of, you're not allowed to do that anymore. But it's been around since the 80s, late 80s, and I don't think they've ever raised their prices. So it's fantastically cheap, but it allows them to continue on. So they bring in money. It's subsidized by the Division of the Humanities at Chicago, but just a little. So that's one model. At the Voltaire Foundation, which is another big, well-funded university at Oxford, they're going to have, they're going to do a digital Voltaire, and we're thinking about multiple, one subscriber base, one free, so different models of how to, because otherwise it's a real danger. And I think the last 20 years of research, one model that can't continue, that isn't, unfortunately was the model, was get 3 years of funding, throw all your money at it, build a really a sort of a bespoke data thing that doesn't work well with anything else. And then as soon as the engineers leave, the professor goes on to another thing, and then it lives on in isolation in some server until it dies and then goes away.
That's what we want to avoid.
We cannot, you can't do that. And so here in France, so something like Humanum, which is this très grande infrastructure or whatever, they'll give you space. They'll give you ways you can put your data. So people are going to begin to think more about this, because it's a real problem, and it's something that even, and then now in funding agencies make you think about it up front. So you have to guarantee at some level some sense of 5 years or 10 years of sustainability. But my only thought on it is that it's an open question, but my thought on this has always been, you have to disassociate the interface from the data. So you have to think in terms of interface, those things change, and they're based on changes in technology. Sometimes you can't control. There's no sense in trying to save one version of an interface, because eventually it just won't work. Just because that's the way it should change, and a good interface should change over time. Now the back of that data, if you make it in a sustainable, interoperable, using industry and academic standards that exist, that's something that you can put into a data repository that will live on whether or not everything else goes away, the interface goes away, that data can live on. And if it's data that's well described, it has good metadata. So if it participates in all those different things, then eventually the dream of all the librarians in the world now is this linked open data that will happen. And so all this data goes into big repositories, and because it's well structured, eventually they'll just sort of link up magically. And it's a bit of Judaism. I mean, it's a bit of faithful thinking, but there's no reason why not to describe your data in such a way that is within linked open data standards, and that can participate. And then you can put it on your because now most institutions require institutional deposits of some data, so wherever it may be. So if you're in Oxford, they have their own system that you deposit your data. If you're in Chicago, they have that. But there's national ones, there's international ones. Europeana is an example of a place where you can park it. So there's different places you can put data, and that's a way of moving it. But it depends really on where a project may be. Some projects, they're happy to be done, and that the funding cycle's over, and then they sort of mothball the active part of it, the interface part of it, and then the data can live on and be reused by other people, and that's a perfectly fine. It's better than dying on a server and never being relived again. Other projects get remade and then turn into other products, and then the interface goes on. So you need to be pretty. You just need to be sort of agile on that front phase, on the interface, and then realize that the core of what you're building, all the intellectual work that's going into it, it's not the interface. It's not, it's the data, it's the annotations, it's the links, it's the metadata, it's the descriptions, and all that should be as well documented and that's something that if done well can continue on with little or no resources, because the infrastructures exist to take that in. So that, I mean, there's no guarantee that things will live on, but that's one way of thinking about it.
And we need the human resources also to work for years. So yeah.
Oh no, that's a whole nother.
Yeah, that's another story.
Because you mentioned Manu, but I think is that research engineer? Yeah. Each project has a research engineer in charge of. If we used because we thought about Manu, and then we opted for a different solution, but we would have to have a research engineer.
No. I mean, no. They'll give you server space. They'll give you a place you can put your data that will become discoverable. So the data gets. It's a French term. It's called moissonné, which I don't understand.
Yeah.
It will be moissonné, and that you just have to be in a national institute. And then there's other levels of other services that may or may not be, but on that level, that it should it's a great repository of research data. It's like HAL, but not for publications, but for research data.
Do you have any other questions, either on the talk itself, on perspectives of the DIGIT.EN.S? Even the people connected, any remarks or questions? Okay.
There's a future. How do you see the future of digital humanities? And do you think that, because you mentioned, the canonization, and do you think that at one point, it will affect also the canon? Because I have the feeling you mentioned, of course, digital humanities apply to Voltaire, but you need very large collection of writings to you need a lot of data. So how do you see how has the digital humanities evolved? And
Sure. I think in let's say the literary sphere, the literary studies, someone like Franco Moretti and his notion of distant reading has been very important because it starts specifically, it's not that digital to begin with. What he wants to do really is challenge the canon. And he says, we studied 100, 200 novels of the Victorian period tops, and that's a lot. You don't even really read those. And he said, but if you look at what was published in 1850 in London, like you're looking at like 0.3% or something, you're looking at this tiny manuscript. So there's this, what they call the great unread. And digitization should bring that back. But because it's so enormous, it's so big, you're going to need then algorithmic sort of mediation to understand that archive. And so that's one area of research that's really interesting to think about. Now, whether or not that challenges the canon is an interesting. It's true that there's all these novels that were published and bought and probably read that now are no longer. That's true, but whether or not then that will challenge the novels that get left over. For example, with Voltaire, he's everywhere at all times. I mean, even he's just in the 19th century. He's just all over the place. Even at times where you'd think maybe not. I mean, it's probably like Shakespeare. I mean, it's just so much. So you maybe have to go down the level to think about where these different boundaries are, or where. And so it may be interesting for me it was interesting to me to sort of trace, because I started out working not in the 18th century, but in the late 19th century and the early Third Republic. And so for me, it was really interesting to think about how Voltaire, that vision, there's different Voltaires that are being actualized at any point in the 19th century. And there's different notions of even the Enlightenment. And so Voltaire gets bound up with that and becomes this different vision of Voltaire. And then Diderot is another really interesting example, because we have a vision of Diderot that comes from the 1950s and 1960s, where it becomes really important. But in the 19th century, he was just this encyclopedia guy. His texts weren't that available. The Neveu de Rameau was discovered in 1890 somebody found the manuscript in a bouquiniste. I mean, so this even Jacques de Fattelis wasn't that well known. The translation by Goethe was more well known than the actual text by Diderot. So that 19th century, which is huge and in which all sorts of things happen, the status of Diderot is interesting. The canonical status of Diderot is interesting. It probably won't change where Diderot ends up, but it can sort of maybe enrich that sort of notion of how the things are changing. At least that's my hope. I don't know if it really will reshuffle things that much, but there are certain things. So I didn't mention it, but something that came out of the Encyclopédie work is that we looked at Émilie du Châtelet. So we took her Institution de Physique, because somebody knew, again, this any good project somebody knows that the article Hypothèse comes from Émilie du Châtelet, but she isn't really mentioned. So they said, "Oh, can you run it through your thing?" And I said, "Of course." So we did it, and we found 20, 25 articles that should realistically, she should be called either at least a co-author.
Yeah.
But she isn't, and there is no woman author in the Encyclopédie. And so that's a way of, maybe that's a challenge. I mean, it's at least adding more information, adding more depth to what's in there. And there's a whole different story about who actually used it and why. But it at least perhaps gives adds another voice to an already sort of loud cacophony in the Encyclopédie. But I don't know if it changes completely our vision, but it can help at least change the conversations. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think
pleasure.
it was just a very rich and fascinating talk with a lot of echoes with, of course, our project, even if we seem to be on a smaller scale for now. But thank you very much, Benro, and thank you very much, everyone, for listening, even through Zoom. And this is recorded, so be able to listen to the podcast again if you wish, or if you have missed it for others. Okay, thank you very much, and bye-bye. And yeah, thank you. I'm just stopping the